Every film fan has that one movie everyone else hates that they will always defend. Okay, so in my case, it's several movies, but today we'll be talking about one of them, the 1964 thriller Night Must Fall, directed by Karel Reisz and starring Albert Finney. Don't be surprised if you haven't heard of this movie. It's pretty much fallen into obscurity since its release in 1964. At the time, audiences stayed away from it, the critics had no use for it. It was based on a 1935 play, and this play was adapted into a 1937 film version starring Robert Montgomery. And in the years since that film's release, it became something of a minor classic. So when MGM announced plans to remake Night Must Fall in the early 60s, there was already a lot of love for this older version, and there was also a lot of familiarity around the original play. The original play was a very popular option for community theater. It was very popular for radio and television adaptation. So I'm sure a lot of people probably felt like there was no point in remaking Night Must Fall. That is, if you're just going to do the same old song and dance. I think MGM knew this. I think they were aware that they were dusting off something that by the early 60s was a pretty creaky thriller. Not to say the original film or the original play are worthless or that they aren't entertaining, but this was something that was very familiar to audiences. So a fresh approach was going to be needed if they were going to make a new version at all. So MGM ended up approaching Karel Reisz, who was a young British filmmaker of the period. He was very involved in the British New Wave movement of the 1950s and 1960s. He had just come off a very successful debut feature film, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which starred Albert Finney. Now, both Finney and Rice were looking to do a follow up film together. They wanted to do a Western set in Australia, but funding for this project ultimately fell through, and when MGM swooped in with the Night Must Fall remake idea, they pretty much latched onto it just because they wanted to keep their creative momentum going. That's not to say Rice was interested in only phoning it in. He approached the idea of restructuring Night Must Fall from the ground up. He did not want to just redo the same old thing. He really wanted to try doing something new with it. And that leads us to the catch-22 I think every remake has to deal with. If you stick too closely to the original, congratulations, your movie is completely pointless. There was no reason to remake it. However, if you try something completely new, that can be equally risky because on one hand, yeah, you're doing something new, but you're also going to alienate people who just want the same old thing. And this is ultimately what happened with Rice's remake. The critics did not like all the changes he made. They felt he was trying to be too arty, that he was trying to infuse too much of a new wave approach into what was a suspense thriller. Now, I disagree. I think this film is very underrated. It is not perfect. It has its issues, but it's a fascinating movie and I think a very effective psychological thriller. So today, I just want to take a look at the film, examine the changes Rice made, as well as the ways in which it is a very effective film and one absolutely deserving of rediscovery. Here's a basic rundown of the plot. The film largely takes place at the remote country cottage of Mrs. Bramson, a hypochondriac widow who largely makes life a living hell for her estranged daughter Olivia and her put-upon maid Dora. When she finds out Dora is pregnant out of wedlock, she demands to meet the father of her baby. This is where Danny enters the story. A charming Welsh bellboy who works at a nearby resort, he quickly charms the old woman with his earnest, playful manner. Quickly forgetting his sexual indiscretions, Mrs. Bramson hires him on the spot to be a handyman and live-in companion for her. Thus begins a psychological juggling act on Danny's part. You see, he gets off on manipulating the three women in the Bramson household, crafting new persona based on what each desires. With Dora, he's a clownish wise-ass. With Olivia, he's a sexy bad boy. With Mrs. Bramson, he's the surrogate son she never had. However, these little mind games can only go on so long before the women start growing wise to Danny's charade. And once Danny's playthings begin to reject him, he grows ever more unstable. And there's something else the women don't know about Danny. He happens to be a psychotic killer who keeps the severed head of his latest victim hidden away in a hat box. The audience is made aware of Danny's homicidal inclinations from the very start. Literally, the opening scene of the film shows him hacking apart his last victim and then hiding the body in the woods. This was a radical departure from the original play and the 1937 film, which for the most part stuck very closely to the original script. In the original play, Olivia is the main character, and she is investigating whether or not Danny is guilty. Indeed, neither Olivia nor the audience are aware of Danny's guilt until the midway point of the original story. However, by the early 60s, this was no longer a twist. Everybody was so familiar with the original plot that keeping this as a twist, it's like keeping Jekyll and Hyde being the same person as a twist. If you were retelling Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it really doesn't make any sense. So Karel Reisz wisely dispensed with the whole mystery angle, even though the critics could not handle that. They felt that to get rid of the mystery angle was to get rid of the original story's suspense. Now, this is just total nonsense. What Reisz did was give the story a new source of suspense. So instead of wondering, ooh, who's the killer, now we know that Danny is a killer, but the women in the Bramson household do not. This change also meant that Reisz had to swap out protagonists. In the original play, Olivia is the main character, while in the remake, Danny is now the central figure. Reisz wanted to make the story more of a character study about why Danny does what he does. Now, the movie actually never spells out the reason Danny gets off on manipulating people or why he murders, and this was another thing that bothered the critics. They felt there should have been more of an explanation. Because, they love the part in Psycho where the psychiatrist came out and explained why Norman Bates kills people. However, this lack of a definitive explanation for Danny's behavior is not a bug, it's a feature, both of the script and of Albert Finney's underrated performance. Whenever he has an audience, Danny becomes whatever his victim wants him to be. His flawless skin and stiff hairdo enhance the character's essential phoniness. But in scenes where Danny is alone, he appears confused and agitated. Danny is essentially a parasite. He needs a host in order to survive, in order to even function. So whenever he's alone, it makes sense that he starts becoming confused, that he even resorts to talking to the severed head in the hat box. He needs any kind of audience in order to exist. Danny's motivations could also be linked to the film's themes of class conflict. Danny and Dora are set up as outsiders to Olivia and Mrs. Bramson's wealthy world. Olivia's snobby boyfriend makes cracks about Danny's masculinity while he's serving dinner.
There you are. Yeah, looks marvelous. Doesn't look too bad, does it? Makes someone a wonderful wife.
Dora quickly picks up that Danny is slowly edging her out in favor of the upper-class Olivia. Olivia is attracted to Danny's rough working-class manners, even as they also repulse her. And Mrs. Bramson is also revealed to have been a servant as a young woman, her current privilege the result of marrying her employer.
In service when I was 14, when service was service. Married at 18, just after the strike.
This detail about Mrs. Bramson's backstory was a change from the original story, and it creates interesting similarities between her and Danny. The two come from similar backgrounds, and they're both essentially performers. It's clear Mrs. Bramson's hypochondria is just an act. In fact, at the end of the film, we see when she gets scared enough, she can get out of that wheelchair with no problem. The power dynamic between these two characters gets weirdly kinky, and it's always shifting. Sometimes Danny puts himself in the role of caretaker.
If you're a good girl tomorrow, I'll take you for a ride in your pram.
Other times, Mrs. Bramson is the disciplining mother figure.
Sorry, Mother.
That's better. You know what happens to little boys who don't appreciate things, who don't learn to look after things properly?
It's very weird stuff. However, anytime Mrs. Bramson gets too playful with Danny, she never forgets to re-erect the class barrier between them.
Hello, hello, hello?
You won't forget the washing up, will you, dear?
As much as she likes Danny, Mrs. Bramson still has her pride, and eventually she grows tired of the games they have going on between them. Unfortunately, and as I've mentioned many times, Danny thrives on these games. So the moment everybody else stops playing, he starts to have a psychological breakdown, and the results get nasty. In later years, Karel Reisz would join the dismissive critical chorus, labeling Night Must Fall as a failed experiment. For him, the thriller element of the original play was an albatross around the remake's neck. Read any interview with the guy, and he constantly says things like, if only we didn't have to have the head in the hat box. If only we didn't have to make Danny a killer, then the plot could have really been interesting. If you had never seen this movie and listened to these complaints, you'd probably expect the thriller elements would be tacked on. But that's not the case at all. As with Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder, Night Must Fall uses its limited location to its best advantage, not often cutting outside of it. There's absolutely no sense of privacy as the characters spy on one another through windows and doorways. The thriller set pieces in this film, while not up there with the best of Hitchcock, are also very strong. The finest of these is the final confrontation between Mrs. Bramson and Danny. Danny has a final breakdown after Mrs. Bramson cuts short their childish games. He briefly leaves the house, and Mrs. Bramson begins to panic in her isolation. The filmmakers keep the camera tight on Mrs. Bramson's face as she wheels herself through the empty house during this sequence, limiting our perspective and really emphasizing a sense of entrapment. Now, not everything about Night Must Fall is perfect. Some of the plot threads aren't fleshed out as much as they could have been, and one in particular ends abruptly. However, the movie doesn't deserve the disaster label that's been applied to it for so long. I don't think Karel Reisz should have felt embarrassed by this. I actually think he should have been very proud. He could have just remade the same old movie, just with more sex and violence, but in the end, he took the more creative route. Warts and all, I think this is one of the most underrated thrillers of the 1960s, and it's absolutely worth your time.